Hi guys, so in this hands-on lesson we're going to set up a VPC endpoint. We're going to use a gateway endpoint to access Amazon S3. So we've got a VPC, we've got a private subnet, and we're going to launch an EC2 instance into that private subnet. And what I want to do is I want to be able to connect to Amazon S3. So we're going to create a gateway endpoint that will create a route table entry pointing to the gateway ID. And then what we're going to do is we're going to also have our EC2 instance in a public subnet. So we can connect from our computer to the public instance, from there to our private instance, and then we're going to try and connect to Amazon S3 from the private instance. Now, because there's no NAT gateway in the private subnet, we know that if this works, it's going via the gateway endpoint. So that's what we're going to set up. Let's head over to AWS and start building this out. Back in EC2, we have our instance running in a public subnet. That's the one we're going to connect to and then jump from there to a private instance. So let's launch an instance in a private subnet. So we're going to use Linux 2 AMI, T2 Micro. And one of the things we're going to need to do is firstly, let's specify the VPC. Let's put it in a private subnet. Private 1B is fine. And we're going to need an IAM role. So I'm going to create this in another window. So what we need is we need an IAM role to be able to access Amazon S3. So let's create a role. It's going to be for an EC2 instance. Click on Next. Let's type S3 and we'll choose the S3 read-only access to give the minimum permissions we need. And I'll call this S3 read-only. Now I actually already have one, so we can see it already exists, but I just wanted to show you the steps. So once you've done that, just create the role. Now let's go back to EC2 and I'm going to choose my S3 read-only role. And by the way, you might need to hit refresh so that it populates the list. And that's everything we need to do there. Let's click on through and we can put this one into the internal access group, and that will allow us to connect from the instance which is in the web access group. That's the public instance. And it also has an outbound rule that allows everything which we need because we'll be connecting to S3 over HTTPS. So let's launch this instance. We've now got our two instances running. So while those are booting, let's go and set up the rest of what we need. So we're going to need to go to S3. In Amazon S3, we're simply going to create a bucket, and I'm going to call this S3 Gateway Test Dash, and then just put some random characters to make sure it's unique. And we don't need to change anything else. We just need to have a bucket that we can list. So once we've got our bucket, let's head into the bucket and just add a couple of files. Doesn't matter what they are. Let's just add a couple of files from our machine so we've got some contents to list when we list our bucket. So I've got a couple of files. I'm going to upload those files and we're all ready now. So let's go back to the VPC management console and set up the S3 gateway endpoint. So back in the VPC management console, we come down to endpoints on the left, choose create endpoint. You'll now see that you can see the services by name. I'm just going to type in S3. Now, in fact, before we hit search here, notice that we have interface endpoints for lots and lots of AWS services, but we only have gateway endpoints for 2. And you can find DynamoDB is right there. And if I just search, it will help me to find S3, which is what we want. So we've got S3 selected. We need to select the correct VPC, and then we need to choose the correct route table. Now the one I want to use is the route table that's associated with the private subnets. So that's not the main route table. The main route table is the one that's associated with the public subnets. So with that selected, we could then select a policy. I'm just going to leave it on full access. You could lock this down if you wanted to. Let's just create this endpoint. So that's it. Our gateway has been created and we can see it's in a status of available. And then if I just pull this up so you can see it better, if we go to route tables, we can see the route table that it's been added to. So let me just try and remember that. This one finishes in DB87. Let's now go to route tables, and that should be this one, our private route table, and it is. So if we go to routes now, notice that we have a new route. Now this route goes to the AWS prefixes for S3 via the gateway endpoint that we just created. Now this is a more specific route than if we had a 0000/0. So even if this was a public subnet with a route out to an internet gateway, this would be more specific, and therefore connections would be routed over this endpoint rather than going out the internet gateway. But we've done it in a private subnet just to be 100% sure. And what we'll do now is we'll head over to EC2 and we're going to copy our public IP, connect into our instance, jump across to our private instance, and then try and list the contents of our S3 bucket. So I'm going to copy the public IP, and let's go over to a command line and connect in using SSH to this instance. So I'm logged into my public instance, and we're going to need to connect to our private instance. Before I do that, I'm just going to create the key pair file. So I've copied the contents of my key pair to my clipboard, pasted in, and that's going to allow me to connect over to the other instance. Now, as I mentioned before, there is another way. This is not the best way. The best way is to use agent forwarding, and that means that you don't have to have a key pair file on your EC2 instance. But the reason I don't use that now is because it has caused a lot of confusion with students, because with different operating systems, the commands are slightly different, and it's just a foolproof way of doing it this way. So just make sure you've got the contents of your key pair file, copy to your clipboard, save that contents into this file here, and then let's go and grab the IP of our private instance and connect across. So I'll establish an SSH connection. I've connected to the instance in my private subnet now, and what I want to do is run AWS S3 ls, and we can see that we've connected to our bucket, and we could then list the contents of the bucket if we like as well by running this command. So we just put in s3:// and then the name of the bucket, hit enter, and that should show us the contents of the bucket. So back in the diagram, I just want to go over what we've done. We created a gateway endpoint, and when we did that, an entry was added to the route table automatically pointing to S3 via the gateway endpoint ID. And then we connected via our instance in a public subnet to our private instance, and we were able to list the contents of our bucket. Now, the only way that that would have worked is via the gateway endpoint, because that private instance doesn't have a NAT gateway, so it can't connect to the internet. So therefore, all traffic went over the gateway endpoint. Now, by the way, you don't pay for gateway endpoints, you only pay for the traffic that you send across them. So we're not too worried about taking this configuration down, but you might want to go in and terminate both of your instances because we don't need those for now.